Second, today is January 11th. In the meantime, it was on this date in 1817 that Timothy Dwight died. Timothy Dwight, he was the president of Yale. I think he was I don't know if he wasn't the first president of Yale. He was a hymn writer. He wrote a hymn called "I Love Thy Kingdom, Lord," which you may know. It's not the best known hymn of the universe. He's also Jonathan Edwards' grandson. So he was probably the best known of Jonathan Edwards' grandsons, as far as most. Well, no, I take that back. There's one other Jonathan Edwards' grandson, which would have been Timothy Dwight's cousin, Aaron Burr, the guy who killed Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. He was also Jonathan Edwards' grandson, so they would have been cousins. It was on this date in 1879 that the Anglo-Zulu War started. The Anglo-Zulu War, the British decided they could take over South Africa, Southern Africa, and the Zulus said, "I don't think so." Had a big, very famous movie made about them. If you've ever seen it, it's and with I think Michael Caine. It's sort of like the British version of the Alamo story, kind of thing. But that took place on this date in 1879. In 1897, Martha Hughes Cannon took office as the first female state senator in Utah. Okay, and it was an interesting campaign because the person she beat for the office was her husband. So this was right around the time she had actually was the fourth of six wives for this guy, and yeah, they were Mormons, yeah, in Utah. And this was right about the time that Mormonism repudiated polygamy, because it was to get into the state, to become a state. Utah wanted to become a state, and so the government said, "Sure, we'll make you a state, but in the U.S., polygamy is illegal, so you have to make polygamy illegal." In 1933, pastors in Hamburg, Germany, issued the Altoona Confession. The Altoona Confession. This was a statement, kind of a document that was the go-to source for the confessing church in Germany in the 1930s. And a confessing church was the church that would not get along with Hitler, that would have nothing to do with Hitler. And let's see, two other things. It was on this date in 1974 that the last original episode of Love American Style aired. How many remember watching Love American Style? Something like that. So yeah, that was on this date in 1974. And for the baseball fans in the room, it was on this date in 1977 that the Cubs traded Rick Monday to the LA Dodgers. Who did they get? Does anybody know? Bill Buckner. They got Bill Buckner, and then, all right, talking about our Through the Bible, our book a week Bible study, that I'm calling it. And today we're going to cover the entire book of Genesis, all 50 chapters. Ready? Set. Buckle up. Here we go. No, we're not going to cover it in that much detail. It's an interesting book, and I will say that Genesis is probably, I taught several, I started teaching adult Bible studies early on when Debbie and I first met. And, I did a couple of studies in this and a couple of studies in that. And then I decided that I wanted to really buckle down and do one on Genesis. And that one study that I did probably did more to make me the teacher that I am today than anything I did beforehand. It was just really transformative. A lot of it had to do with the commentary that I was using, to the point where, and I liked the commentary and the commentary writer so much that I contacted him, got to know him, invited him to come out to our church and do a seminar on teaching the text, and have pretty much bought I haven't read them all, but I bought every book that he's ever written, I think. And so I have fond memories of Genesis. And I think Genesis, I mean, it's true of any book in the Bible, but Genesis and Revelation both have in common that like, anything that can go wrong will, in terms of looking at these two books. And there's a lot of generally accepted wisdom about these books that may or may not be true. It's just we all kind of believe it, and so nobody questions it, so we go with it. And we'll talk about a few of those today. Um, but I wanted to point out that Genesis is book one of a five-part series known as the Pentateuch. Okay. And the interesting thing, or the important thing to remember about Genesis, and it's similar with Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as well, is that Genesis was never meant to be read alone. Okay. So it's again it's part one. It's part one of a five-part series. Okay. So it 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 it's part and parcel of these other books. So again, if you're looking at whoever put the Pentateuch together, it's just the first part. Okay, I mean it's kind of a lot, and I know people do this, and I think I might have mentioned this last week, where when we had our kids were talking about their friends watching movies, and they were indicating that they had watched part two and part three of a movie series, but had never watched part one, which was just like, how can you do that? Okay, how can you? I mean, I can understand watching part one and not watching part two and three, kind of thing. Um, Usually, you do that when you just don't like part one. Okay, you just say, well, if I didn't like part one, what makes you think I'm going to like part two? Um, but we kind of do that. We look at Genesis and we say, okay, Genesis is complete in and of itself, and to a certain extent, it is. There's God's word is not going to return to him void, but it is part of the Pentateuch. Okay, so it's and at one point maybe the first time I did this one, I looked at the Pentateuch a little bit differently. I looked at it as a single unit, and you could say that the historical part of the Pentateuch is Genesis through mid Exodus, because once you get to the middle of Exodus, that's kind of where the action stops. There's stuff that happens, periodically. Like in Leviticus, there's things that happen in Leviticus. Actually, there's only one thing that happens in Leviticus. That's Nadab and Abihu die. But other than that, there's no action in Leviticus. But then you get to Numbers and Deuteronomy. There's some things that happen. Um, but Genesis was never meant to be read in isolation. Okay, it was never meant to be read by itself. So really, if you're going to, it should be, we should be studying the Pentateuch and doing, and just starting with Genesis. Does that make sense? I just don't, you know, um, most people, you don't hear a lot of people getting really excited about studying, Numbers, the book of Numbers or the book of Deuteronomy, and then moving, but you do get a lot where people do Genesis, and I did. I'm one of them. But again, it's part of the Pentateuch. So what type of book it is? It's a narrative book. It tells a story. Okay. In fact, it's a series of narratives. It's a series of accounts. Okay. It's actually a series of accounts, and the Hebrew word there is Toledoth. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I've got it spelled there, Toledoth. Okay, Toledoth. All right, and if you look through the book of Genesis, you'll see this. It's an account. Most translations will say, this is the account of, and then it'll tell the story. And there are 11 of them through the book of Genesis. There are 11 accounts. And so what happens is you see that, and kind of thinking about how was the book put together, it's like somebody collected these stories. So who originally told these stories? Okay, who originally gave? So I mean, I kind of imagine at some point somebody says to Moses, "Hey Moses, tell us the story of Noah. Tell us that story of Noah." And Moses says, "All right, well here's the account of Noah. Here's what happened," and somebody's writing down what he has to say, and they try to put it in a file folder in a file cabinet and close it away. And then later on, somebody, hey, tell us about Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And he said, all right, here's what happened. Here's the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so he writes it down and they put it. And so later on, somebody gets together and says, okay, let's put all of these together, all of these accounts, and put them in roughly chronological order. And that's going to be the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings kind of thing. So what are these accounts, just so we know? The first one is the account of the heavens and earth, which start at chapter 2, verse 4. Then you have the account of Adam. So you have the account of Adam. Then you have, starting in Genesis 5:1, you have the account of Noah, starting in 6:9. You have the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which start in chapter 10, verse 1. Then a chapter later, you have the account of Shem, again, one of Noah's sons. So there is, the text will say, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it'll say, this is the account of Shem. In chapter 11, verse 27, you have the account of Terah. Okay, the account of Terah, which is at what we would probably look at that and say, oh, that's all about Abraham. Well, Terah was Abraham's father, kind of thing. But it says, this is the account of Terah. And the first thing is, now the Lord said to Abram, get thee out of thy house. Again, that kicks off in chapter 12. But you can see that the account of Terah, which is the story of Abraham, goes on for quite some time, for about 14 chapters long. Then you have the account of Ishmael, which is fairly short. Then you have the account of Isaac. Then there are actually two accounts of Esau. So if you're counting, I said 11, you say, wait, there's only 10. It's because there's two of Esau. So one of them starts in 36:1, and then the next one starts 8 verses later. So this is the account of Esau, and then it says, this is the account of Esau. It's two different stories, but you have two different accounts. And then finally, you have the account of Jacob, which starts in chapter 37, okay, and goes through the rest of the book, which most of us would look at it, okay, what's chapter 37 through the end of the book of Genesis about? If you're any familiarity with Genesis at all, you say, oh, that's about Joseph. Well, actually, it's the account of Jacob. Okay, so again, this is how the writer would have organized the book itself. Who are the original readers of the accounts? Probably pre-kingdom Jews. So I'm looking at this in two ways, and I've kind of mentioned this before, that these were written out. I think they were written down for posterity. So pre-kingdom Jews, people around Moses, people going into during the period of the judges and all that, would have read them. Of the actual book itself, when did they collect the book together? And again, this is part of the Pentateuch, so the dates are the same as Leviticus. Probably around 600 or 700 BC is when the book was put together in the form we have it today, kind of thing. Okay, so there were some editors going on, people that were kind of putting their touches on, making sure this story was in and that story was in. Okay, who's the author? Well, the author, Genesis, like Leviticus, has no authorial claim. Nowhere in the book does it say anybody wrote this, kind of thing. But most ascribe it to Moses. Now, this is there's, again, when you get into the authorial discussion of the Pentateuch, that's a huge discussion. I mean, if you remember, there was like some have looked at it and said there's 4 different sources, the JEPD document kind of thing, and although that could just be Moses at a different time. When he's early in his career, he's writing this way. When he's later in his career, he's writing that way. We look at Bible writers sometimes and we think, okay, well, this person can only he can only write this one way. The idea that he can't write a different way. I mean, there are a number of people in the U.S. who have had number one bestseller, New York Times bestsellers, both fiction and nonfiction. That they can write 2 different genres, sort of thing. But be that, so it's mostly Moses. I mean, Exodus 17:24, Deuteronomy 31 talk about Moses writing those books, And again, the Pentateuch is a single literary work. Okay, so and Genesis is just part one kind of thing. There were clearly other persons involved. One way you know that is because there are several references of something being true to this day. So somebody is looking back on things and say, okay, this well was built, and to this day it's still here. They called it Beersheba, and to this day it's still known that. In fact, there's at least 4 times in there where you'll read through and say to this day. And so when you see that phrase, that marker, that's telling you that whoever is editing this is coming from a distance back or later. Okay, it's not at the same time. Okay, so I mean, it wouldn't make any sense for me to say, Stan is here today, and to this day he's wearing a blue shirt, because well, it's today, kind of thing, you know. Um, but you could say that, oh, Stan started with the discussion of Genesis, and to this day he's still haranguing on Genesis, kind of thing. So um, that that's kind of one of the indications that it was something that it came much later. That there was some editing that went on much later. So yeah, they're not all. Not all of these videos are 2 parts. This is unusual. So, all right. So we have a good idea of kind of the big picture of how the book works. Um, Looking on the handout, it says, what does the title mean? Beginnings. What's the book about? Clearly 2 sections: creation to Abram, and then Abram to Egypt. That's my division. At the end of the book, they're in Egypt. The whole family, 70 members of the family, have all moved down to Egypt. So honestly, is anybody in your head singing "Go Go Go Joseph"? From Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So looking at the book, what is its purpose? The purpose of the book is to show the how and why God chose to work through a single family. Okay, that of Abraham. So I remember reading a book one time that it was written by it's called Farewell to God, written by a guy named Charles Templeton. Anybody know Charles Templeton? Does anyone ring a bell? He had been a contemporary of Billy Graham, and they were like a pair. They were, Templeton was Canadian, and Billy Graham was. I mean, they were pals, they were friends, and they were both very successful evangelists. And I mean, they thought that between the two of them, they were going to just evangelize the world. Well, Templeton gave up at some point. I'm not exactly sure when, but he didn't make it much past the early 1960s as being an evangelical leader. And he went on to be be the editor of Maclean's magazine, which was like Time Canada's version of Time magazine, or U.S. News, or something like that. Very interesting magazine, by the way. If you ever get a chance to read Maclean's, it's good. It's still printed. But he wrote a book in the 1980s called Farewell to God, where he kind of explains why he left, and all of kind of like a deconversion, what ex-evangelical, what we call him today. But he was like, things that he couldn't understand. He said, do you really believe? One of his questions was, do you really believe that God would work through one family to bless the world? And yeah, yes, I do, because that's what Genesis says. I mean, it's yes, and here's why. If you Genesis 1 through 11, you have the opportunity. They have the opportunity to kind of work it out on their own, and it fails miserably. Okay, now Abraham's family fails miserably as well. And it's just one of the things that, and when you read through the stories, and you just kind of read through them without stopping every line, you kind of see, man, these guys were really a bunch of screw ups, kind of thing. Okay. And basically the Bible is just full of flawed individuals. I mean, so I just, there's this new David movie out. Has anybody seen this new David movie yet? I don't. Did you? Um, I I'm not going to go watch this because I'm just going to get mad. I know enough. Uh, Having just gone through the book of Samuel, and I'm going to watch this cartoon version of of David's life, I'm going to go, that's not right. That's not right. That's not right. So I personally am not going to. I'm not planning on it. I may end up somewhere where suddenly it's like playing in front of me. I'm like, okay, well, um, but this will be one of those moments that Debbie just loves when I'm sitting in the church service going, she's stop it, kind of thing. But yeah, but somebody's got to do. So. But yeah, there's some seriously flawed individuals going on here. But one of the themes and messages of the book, well, it introduces the Israelite God. Okay, it introduces the Israelite God, um, and it shows the role of people in the newly created world. Okay, so left to themselves, where does it go? Okay, it goes south pretty quick. Oh, I'm sorry, here I didn't get you. Here, we're at the bottom of the page. Sorry. So shows the role of people. It shows how man and woman disturb the equilibrium originally established. Okay, so how could God create a world like this? Well, he didn't create a world like this. He created a perfect world, and we screwed it up. Okay, man, Adam, the name means man. So it's like man. Uh, um, and then it shows overall how God brings good out of evil. At the end, and again, we have the verse that Joseph says there, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Okay, so if you go turn over, looking at the book itself, what are some of the problem passages in the book? And the thing about this is you can there is a controversy over pretty much every single story in the book of Genesis, every point you could make. And so I'm starting to think, kind of going through, okay, which ones do I want to talk about? So these are my favorites. You all may have different favorites, um, but be that as it may, some of the things that when you talk about Genesis, and I think one of the things that we have to remember, what is the purpose of Genesis? The Genesis is to show why God, the how and why that God chose a single family to bring His plan about. Okay, that's the purpose of the book. Okay, and it's got the message, and sometimes we try to make Genesis something it's not. Okay, specifically, and the number one way we do this is we try to make Genesis a science book. Okay, and it's not. Okay, so I remember there was and my first thing is like the creation narrative. Okay, is there one or are there two? Okay, well, there are two. Okay, so the first account, and generally the way most people look at it is the first account is the creation of heaven and earth. Okay, so that's chapter 2, 2 and 3. The creation and the fall are in that first account of the Toledots that we were talking about earlier. Okay, then an editor came in later and said, okay, let's summarize this in the first account. Okay, so it's not, it doesn't, very few people really think that somebody sat down one day and said, all right, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Okay, next, let's write chapter 2, and then write chapter 3. Okay, somebody came in and put these. And so you have issues between these two accounts, especially if you try and use Genesis to prove your particular view of creation. Okay, now this is your diheretic moment. Here we go. Right? Well, actually, there's a couple of other even better diheretic moments. I remember several years ago there was a debate with Ken Ham from the Ark in the Ark Encounter um, Creation Museum Ark Encounter, um, and somebody else. It doesn't. I forget who. And I was watching a podcast that had John Walton on it. Now, John Walton is the guy that wrote the commentary that I was talking about, the guy that I met and all that. And John Walton is the guy that is, he's an Old Testament guy, Hebrew Hebrew, Greek, Sumerian, Akkadian, all of these different languages he knows. You know, brilliant, brilliant guy. Um, and he was being interviewed about this debate, and his take on the debate was not whether or not, or he was disappointed in the debate because, you know, the debate got into this. Well, could God have created the world and this and that and the other, and they were using Genesis 1, and he said, you know, the problem is they never really talked about what Genesis was trying to do. So they were using this verse to support their particular view. Okay, so if you look at, like, even in the chapter 1 verse 1, okay, you know, the Hebrew rendering of that is, you know, when in the beginning God was creating the world. That there's kind of a, you know, now the creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is something that came in the New Testament. There, you know, God, I forget, Colossians, I think it is. Now, that is not to say that God cannot and is perfectly capable of creating the world in 7 days, in 7 minutes, 7 seconds. Pick your time period. It doesn't really matter. The point is, that's not what Genesis is trying to do, what Genesis 1, the creation narratives, are trying to do. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm not saying, oh, yay evolution or yay creation. I'm just saying that's not what Genesis is trying to talk about. Okay, what Genesis is trying to talk about, or the point he's trying to make in opposition to common creation stories of the day, and it's on your handout, what either or both show is that God intentionally created humans. Okay, that's the point. That we are here by design. Now, I am not an expert on every creation myth ever, but most other pagan accounts would describe the creation of man, humans, men, women, as something accidental, kind of a collateral damage to a battle that the gods were having. And oh, look, we made a mess. What kind of a mess? Well, there's people down there now. What are we going to do with them? Whereas Genesis is showing that our creation, the creation of humans, was an intentional thing. Okay, it wasn't accidental. Okay, now that leads to an idea of a short creation period, because it's like, well, you know, if you're omnipotent and omniscient, then why not do it in a short period of time? Okay, 5 days, 7 days, 6 days, I guess, kind of thing. All right. But what Genesis and the author of Genesis, what Moses is trying to make, this is all intentional. We're not here accidentally. We're here intentionally. I'm sorry, Dennis, you have a.
Just real quickly, what you just said, I heard a week ago from Vernon McGee on this book. And one of the things he said that struck me was exactly what you just said, which I think is just really brilliant. It's not a science book. If it was a science book, the people of the day wouldn't have understood it.
Right.
If there was a methodology behind this that is explainable, it would have been really hard for anybody to understand it back in that day.
I always like to make sure I'm in line with J. Vernon McGee. I find no.
He's a good man.
Yeah, no.
Die here. He's a good man.
There you go. All right, I got my first Die Heretic. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the way I think about the two accounts is that the first one is the overview of the entire creation, and then the second one zooms in on the human beings and tells their account. So like one is broad, and that's the end of that account. And then start the new account, and it zooms in specifically on, at the end of the week, we had men and women, and this is what happened to them.
That's a common way to look at the two different accounts. But again, the point Genesis is making is it's intentional. Okay, but leading up to the men and women. So who is responsible for the fall? Okay, who is responsible for the fall? Okay, so in this one, again, you know, let's throw the women under the bus, and say that it was the women's fault because Eve was deceived, and you know the men. You know, if the men would have been there, it wouldn't have happened like that. I like to think that's the case, and I'm good with that. And let's move on to the next one. Actually, the key passage in terms of looking at the fall, um, and again, I think they put, they started this blame game sort of thing. Um, where let's see, the woman for TV's, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you die. When the woman saw that the fruit of the, this is chapter 3, beginning with verse 6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Okay. So, regardless of, you know, I kind of see that, and again, it's just imagining because, this, I imagine the guy is there kind of watching this go on. There's a conversation going on because who else is Adam talking to, right? Okay, so they're having a conversation here, and oh, I'm going to do it, and maybe she was deceived. Well, she was. The Bible says pretty clearly that she was deceived. Adam wasn't. Okay, so mankind did not fall because Eve ate the apple. Mankind fell because Adam ate the apple. Okay, and I say that because there's a couple of things that has repercussions throughout history. This whole idea, well, Eve, so Eve can't be trusted, women can't be trusted, kind of thing. And I mean, there's some truth to that. I'm just saying. I'm sorry. Die here. It's kind of, but man, it was Adam's sin. Okay, not Eve's, Adam's sin. And again, I mean, you still hear this even now. There's conversations. Listening to a podcast the other day about some stuff that went on in the Southern Baptist Convention. They're like, oh well, Eve fell and Eve ate the apple, and it's okay. So that's one thing. Here's the real good one. This is the fun one. The proto-evangelium. Okay, does anybody know what the proto-evangelium is? That's the
Heard about it.
Yeah, you did. That's the foot and the heel in Genesis 3:15. Okay, so is this a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Okay, our guy here is very clearly a thumbs up. I am very clearly a thumbs down. That is not a prophecy of Christ. Okay, that is not a prophecy of Christ. For a couple of reasons. One, the word seed there in Hebrew is plural. Okay, the gist of it is the idea is that what is being promised, to kind of paraphrase it or rephrase it in another way, it says, as a result of what you did, as a result of what happens here, you are going to have a lifetime of struggle. Your descendants are going to have this lifetime of struggle back and forth. Okay, that's what the verse is promising. It's a promise that there's going to be a lifetime of struggle. Okay, so another reason why I know that. So how do I know? Like there's other Old Testament passages where, like in Isaiah, where you could say, well, that clearly is talking about Jesus. Okay, how and why can't I look at that one? Well, there's a big difference. Like the verses in Isaiah are referenced in the New Testament. So a New Testament writer, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, looked back and said, that's Jesus. Okay, no New Testament writer looked back to Genesis 3 and said, that's Jesus. In fact, it wasn't until the second century when they started to have New Testament and the New Testament started to get put together that people like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus went through the Old Testament and said, hey, we need to find Jesus in every story, kind of thing. And maybe you've heard something like that, where Jesus is in every story. The Old Testament is drenched with Jesus. No, I have a friend who's was a professor at Moody, not John Walton, a different guy. But he would get students into the graduate Bible program, and he'd say that one of the first things they'd have to do is they'd have to go through and remove Jesus from the Old Testament, because it's not, you're looking at it. That's eisegesis. You're looking into the Bible. Oh, Jesus has got to be there. Okay. Oh, there's a battle. Okay, there's a battle, and it's going to crush his head. Oh, that has to be about Jesus. No, it doesn't. kind of thing. So again, die heretic. I know we want it to be about Jesus, but I don't think it is. Okay, again, um, I will still fellowship with you if you disagree with me. Debbie, on the other hand, she's a little, I don't know, kind of thing. But yeah, the
So what is it in reference to? But I've
it's
never heard anything other than
right.
it's sheep. Well, so
It's
so help me with
it,
what is it?
it's that for the rest of existence there will be this ongoing battle
Okay.
between sin and your desires, and I think the rest of the book of Genesis shows that. I mean, every time they get going, the flawed individuals through the book. So yeah, look up John Walton on the, he's the guy. Um, so that's one thing. After the flood in Genesis 9, okay, what did Ham do? Okay, in Genesis 9, there's so the flood happens, and again, we can spend some quality time talking about the flood and where's the ark and all of that. But in Genesis 9, we told the story here that who was it? Noah gets drunk and is in his tent, and then Ham comes in and does something. Okay, um, find the text here.
9:22.
Okay, 9:22. The sons of Noah came, etc., etc. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders, and they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of the slaves will he be to his brothers." He also said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." Okay. What did Ham do? Okay. Here's the answer. We don't know. Okay. We don't know. However, whatever it is, okay, we one of the problems we have with this, and I say this is because as a result of this, okay, this is one of the proof texts for racism. People say, why do we treat races differently? Why historically have we treated races differently? Well, there were people when I went to school, there was a very clear, okay, well, certain races are clearly descendants of Canaan, descendants of Ham. And so the Bible says we need to treat them differently. Okay. Um, the problem here is all we have, this is what Noah says. Now, whether Noah has the power and the authority to curse somebody or not, we don't know. Okay. This is just, again, with the narrative text, when you read something somebody said, okay, that's all you know. That's what they said. Was he cursed in any sort of metaphysical, is that the right word, any sort of real way? I don't know. We know Noah's upset. I mean, you could just look at the way the NIV translates it and just said, ham walks in ham walks in, sees his dad, and rather than covering him up, goes out and tells Shem and Ham. Okay, so now there's all kinds of discussions about, oh no, he did this, he did that, he did this, he did this, kind of thing. Okay, but it is not a basis, whatever it is not a basis for um, racial profiling. Say, oh well, this race clearly comes from Canaan, and so therefore we have to do this. Okay, so this is, again, remember I said that anything that can go wrong will in Genesis, and this is one text that people still use, okay, to do that. Um, so let's see, what other things that I find interesting. Why does God choose Abram in Genesis 12? Why does God choose Abram? Well, because he was a good, godly man, right? No, he was an idol worshiper. Okay, we don't know. Okay, it just, all we know is God did. Okay, why did God choose us? Was it because of the good things we've done? No. Okay, just God in his wisdom and in his mercy said, you know what, Abram's going to be the guy. And again, I'm just speculating here that in chapter 12 it says the Lord came to Terah, or it's the account of Terah, And it could be that he went to all of the family, because actually the whole family moved halfway and then Abram moves the rest of the way, kind of thing. So it could be that the call went out to Terah, because again, we weren't there. We didn't know the kind of thing. The call went to Terah's family, and Abram was the one that responded. Okay, so it could have been, what is it, Nahor? Laban? No,
Nahor.
Nahor. It could have been Nahor that went, but he didn't. You know, he had the opportunity, but didn't. Abram was the one. So God said, listen, I'm going to throw this test group out. I'm going to make a, here, I want you to come. And Abram was the one that that left. Abram was the one that moved on. But we don't know why. Okay, we just know that he did. We just have to trust in God's sovereignty that he wanted a family. And the point of choosing a family, and they make it clear here, was that God was going to use this family in some way to reverse the effects of the fall, to save, all of these things were meant for harm. God is accomplishing it. God intended it for good, because through Abraham's family, blessing would come to the world in some way. If you read Isaiah, there's all kinds of pictures in Isaiah of prophecies of the world coming to Israel for blessing. Okay, now that's not going on right now. I'm just saying. Okay, and again, this gets into a whole nother conversation about whether the Israel of today is the Israel of God's people and all that kind of stuff. But we talked about that in a previous class. But that it was to bless the people. Now, kind of like, when we're God's people today, sort of like what Pastor Jared was talking about. We're to love. We are to be a blessing to others. Okay, and that's not something. I mean, there are definitely days that I have I don't really accomplish that. Okay, like, oh, don't know that I really blessed anybody today, kind of thing. But sort of in a similar way. Why did God choose Abraham? Note in the promise that's given in Genesis chapter 12. So we know the story of Abram. So the story of Abram, and then it becomes Abraham after the whole covenant in Genesis 15. Abraham needs an heir, and it's interesting that there's 4 heirs that are noted. First it's Eliezer. No, first it's Lot. Okay, and then Lot's got to get out of the way. Okay, then it's Eliezer, his servant. Okay, then it's Ishmael. Okay, then it's Isaac, and then finally it gets to Isaac, and then what does God ask him to do? Right, to sacrifice. Like, wait a minute, I had an heir, you didn't like him. I had another heir, you didn't like him. I had another heir, you didn't like him. Now I've got this heir that you like, and you're telling me to kill him, kind of thing. So, but the interesting thing about this whole story is the promise. There's no indication in the text that the promise was given to Sarai, okay, until later. So Abram is given this promise, like when he's in his 60s. Hey, you're going to be the father of many nations, right? And he's married to Sarai. Okay, Sarai isn't given the promise. Okay, so we like to dump on Abraham and say, oh well, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have slept with Hagar, but that was how things were done back then. That was the normal thing, because again, Jacob ends up in a similar situation. Okay, I can't here use my handmaid, kind of thing. That was how, because you had to have an heir. I mean, that was succession, and all that was critically important. That was just how things were done. That was a perfectly normal, for the day, way of dealing with this. How am I going to get an heir? To use what we would call today a surrogate mother. Okay, that was perfectly normal. And for 13 years, Ishmael was the heir. And it isn't until Abram is now 100 years old, and the three angels come to visit him, 2 or 3 come to visit him, and then he repeats, "Oh, Abram, you're gonna have a son," and Sarah, your wife, is going to have it, and Sarah's listening, and then they both laugh because they think it's funny, okay? Because he's 100, she's 90, they're going to have a kid, okay? You know, and that's the first time Sarah finds out that, oh, she's going to be part of this, okay? There's no indication. So it's like, Abram was just doing what guys did at that point, what you know, uh, family leaders did at that point, okay? So her actions, 16:1, are consistent with the culture of the day. Um, let's see, a couple of other things here. There's, going through there's a couple of interesting stories that just seem to kind of stick out. Dinah, the story of Dinah, um, in chapter 34. I'm sorry, that's Genesis. That should be where it says Exodus there. That should be Genesis. I'm sorry, that's my mistake. Um, they're living in they're living in Shechem in chapter 34, and I don't really have a good answer for this one. They're living in Shechem. No, they're living, and the guy named Shechem. The Bible says that he rapes Dinah, which is Jacob's daughter. Okay, Jacob has other daughters, but only one is named. He rapes Dinah, but he loves her. The NIV says he rapes her. I think others said he just sleeps with her. But he loves her and wants to marry them. He wants to marry her. Okay, and so you guys familiar with this? It doesn't get preached on a lot. Okay, so Shechem goes to the father, goes to Jacob, and says, my son wants to marry your daughter, and can we arrange this? And the sons, Jacob's sons, say, well, sure, if all of your family and all of your town, all of the men get circumcised. Okay, so they say, okay, for love, we'll do it. And so they all go get circumcised, and while they're still recovering from this, two of the sons, Simeon and Levi, pick up the sword and come in and kill off the whole town, all the men. Okay, now what that does explain is you think, no, okay, remember, of his sons, of Jacob's sons, which one is the son that the line comes through? Judah, not the first son, not Reuben, and not Simeon and Levi. That's 2 and 3. So what did Simeon and Levi do that probably Genesis 34? Okay, and so Reuben, this will, for those of us who were there for David, one of the things that so Jacob gets married to Rachel, and then is switched, gets Leah. Now he's got 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and each of the wives has a handmaid, and so Jacob is sleeping with all 4 of these to create 12 kids. One of the handmaids is a woman named Bilhah. Okay, I forget which one. I think it's Leah's, but it's one of the handmaids, which are seen at the point once Abraham is sleeping with her, then she becomes a concubine. Remember, we talked about concubines with David. Okay, so there's a real brief mention in Genesis where Reuben comes back and goes to sleep with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Okay, and then that poem, that long, very important poem he talked about at the end, it says why Reuben, the firstborn son, isn't the one that's going to be the heir apparent, because you slept with my concubines, Simeon and Levi. You guys are violent. Reuben, or not Reuben, Judah, the 4th one, you're the one that the scepter is going to come. So it's like that story kind of ties into why Reuben, those 2 stories kind of tie in. Okay, why Reuben, Simeon, and Levi are not chosen to be the next thing. Then in Genesis 38, there's another fun story. Tamar. Tamar is a daughter-in-law of daughter-in-law of who? Reuben. Judah. Now I know I said all this to So Judah's got 3 sons, and Tamar marries the oldest son, and he died. So the oldest son marries Tamar, and then he dies before children. Now, again, we talked about the Levirate marriage, where the brother would sleep with the wife, the widow, and then the child would be considered his other child. So the second son is told by Judah, hey, go sleep with your brother's wife, have a kid, and then she'll have a son, because we talked about how important that was in the culture. Basically, he refuses, make sure it doesn't happen. God says, okay, I'm going to kill you. He gets killed. God says, hey, kills him for failing to follow this rule. Um, and so Judah says to Tamar, okay, just wait. I'll give you my youngest son when he gets old enough. Okay. But the fact is, he doesn't. Now, this is all in Genesis 38. He doesn't. And so Tamar is waiting, kind of. And so then she realizes, how does this go? That she's going to, that Judah's going to be out. So she dresses like a prostitute. There's a certain outfit, sits on the side of the road. Judah comes along, says, hey, okay, let's do this. They do it. Says, what are you going to pay me? Says, I'm going to pay you a goat. Would you have a goat with you? No, I'll send it to you. She says, well, give me something to show that you've done this. And so Judah says, all right, well, here's my staff and my cloak or something, his ring. Gives him a couple of identifiable things that it's Judah. And so then, okay, great. I'll give these back when you send me the goat or whatever the thing was. He goes, and then 3 months later, he sends the goat, and there's no shrine prostitute there. He's asking, where's the shrine prostitute that was here? And he's like, I don't know. Nobody knows there wasn't one. And he's like, well, who knew? Right? So he waits 3 months, and then suddenly somebody comes to him and says, hey, your daughter Tamar your daughter-in-law Tamar is pregnant. Okay, now which means it could only have happened through some um, unfaithfulness, or and so he's ready to kill her. I mean, he's gonna just execute her for this. And they could do that. And on the way, she says, hey, wait a minute, I'm willing to name the guy who impregnated me, and it's the guy who owns this staff and this ring. And it's interesting there where Judah says something along the line of, she is more righteous than I, kind of thing. Again, this is not a story that gets preached about a lot. I don't know why, but one of the interesting things is the next chapter. The next chapter in the Bible after that is chapter 39, and that's the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And there's a parallel between these two stories, and it kind of illustrates how Joseph was able to be honorable in a situation, in a sexual situation, contrasting Joseph with Judah, to say, okay, who is the real righteous son here? It's Joseph, kind of thing. Now, why wasn't Joseph made I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I guess he was just going the primogenitor. It would have taken too long to get down to the 12th son.
His son got two counts. Joseph's son.
Yeah, yeah. And there, one of the other things that the rule of primogenitor, that the oldest gets the good stuff, and the second, it's just like routinely. I mean, really, is it ever actually followed in the Bible? I mean, is there a situation where it's actually the oldest gets the good stuff? Because it's always changing. So here, even with Joseph's sons, you have Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh is the older, and Isaac goes to bless them. No, Jacob goes to bless them. Israel goes to bless them, and he crosses his hands, and he puts, like, the right hand is the one that gives the bigger blessing, and the left hand, and he puts the hand on Ephraim, who's the younger. And Joseph goes and it sends in a text. Joseph goes to pull his hand and says, no, you got it wrong. You got it. And Israel's like, no, I got it right. Just go away, boy. I got it right, kind of thing. And then Ephraim and Manasseh are become two of the tribes of Israel, or the half tribe of Ephraim, the half tribe of Manasseh. The last thing I that's always find interesting is in Genesis 47. What does Joseph actually accomplish in Egypt? Okay, so again, the story. Joseph, Pharaoh has a dream. He says, find somebody that can fix this. And another question is to ask, as you're looking at the story of Israel in Egypt, in Goshen there, how did they end up in slavery? How was it that they They end up in slavery. So what happens is, there's a famine, and the famine happens, and Joseph says, "Come on, okay, well, pay for the food. We'll pay for the food." And they said, "Okay." So they pay for. Then they run out of money. This is everyone in Egypt runs out of money. Says, "Okay, well, pay for the land. Give it with your land." So I give the everybody in Egypt gives with their land. He says, "We don't have any land. We don't have any money." He said, "Well, just give yourselves to me." And he does. And in chapter 47, where it's talking about, um, let's see, for fifth, what's my verse 15 through 21. That is why they did not sell their land. Allotment, that's why they didn't, blah, blah, when the crop comes in, there was no food. Our money is all gone. They brought them through that year. When that year was over, why should we perish? By us. So in verse 19, chapter 47, verse 19, why should we perish before your eyes? This is Egyptians talking. We and our land as well. Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude. So when people talk about Joseph, and again, being a great guy and an amazing leader, and don't get me wrong, he was an administrator. He really got this, you know. But when Joseph was through, everybody in Egypt was a slave. Okay, so yeah, we need somebody with the wisdom of Joseph to lead the country. I don't know about that. I kind of like owning a house, you know, it's troublesome as it is. But those are like my favorite problem. What's your favorite problem passage in Genesis?
I'd love to hear your thoughts about the negotiation to save Sodom.
Well, it's interesting, you know, that it says, God knew how many righteous people were there the whole time. God knew that at most there were four righteous people, and it's questionable whether those four were righteous or not. I mean, he had an obligation to Lot. The rest of them were kind of questioned. So, but Abraham doesn't know that. And so, I mean, it really says something about Abraham that, on the one hand, he suspects that things aren't as well as he thinks. He thinks, oh, my nephew Lot's in there. Surely he evangelized somebody. But he starts thinking 50. Oh, maybe, I don't know, 50. Let's go, maybe 40. What about 35? What about 20? What about 10? And I've seen the math where it's like, okay, well, there's this and the kids. It had to be at least 10, right? She had at least a friend, and it turns out he didn't have anyone. So I think it says a lot about Abraham willing to put himself on the line for that, to say, questioning what God would do.
The key is that God knew.
God knew how many righteous people.
Sure, I will do it. Sure, I will do it.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of deals where you ask for something, or you're in a negotiation and you throw out an offer, and they say, okay, we'll take it. You immediately think, whoa, I could have asked for twice as much, or I could have asked for half as much, or whatever.
I always thought of that story as being the origin story of Moab, because Moab comes up so often after that.
How is that the origin story of Moab?
Because they flee, he ends up in the rocks.
Oh, yeah.
Daughters,
Right.
one son.
Okay, I'm thinking of the Abraham negotiation piece. That's part of that story, but yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's a whole nother weird. There's a lot of weirdness in again, this is why I couldn't watch a cartoon movie of the life of Abraham either, because I'd be like, okay, are you going to talk about Lot here? That's part of it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like, this is part of it. You have to. It's it's. Did anybody see the movie Yesterday? I'll forget the guy's name. An Indian actor who, the world has a wire shortage, and everybody has forgotten the Beatles. Okay, nobody knows. It's a fun little movie, except for this guy. And so he's the only one that remembers all of the Beatles musics, and he's a musician, and so he starts playing Beatles songs, and he becomes a phenomenally successful person, right? Because he's singing these Beatles songs. And the problem I had with that song, and again, I like the Beatles as much as the next guy, probably more, but the the Beatles music came out of a particular context. Okay, so I mean, Sergeant Pepper came out during the Summer of Love, created the Summer of Love, perhaps, there was this whole zeitgeist going on at the same time. And so this song meant something in the time of 1967, and to see it in 2022, if I play this song from Sergeant Pepper, it's going to be as successful. Well, no, maybe, you're taking it out of its context. So that's why, if I'm watching and again, this is me, you know, at the school, the kids are all talking about this David movie. They all want to go see this David movie. Okay, go see the David movie. It's only going to warp you slightly. You know, your poor Bible teacher someday is going to have to walk back the David story. Okay, I know you saw this in the David movie, but anything else? Any other favorite parts of Genesis? All right, so next week we're going to talk about Job. I know. Am I going in order? Sort of. So next week we're going to talk about Job, and then we're going to get back into Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We'll be more or less in order for a while there after we talk about Job. I'll tell you why we're going to talk about Job next week. So, all right. Well, thank you very much for coming. See you guys next week. Where's my bag?